Hello, welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm going to be doing a bunch of Clash tier lists for patch 13.14, so if you enjoy the content, like and subscribe, and let's get into it. There are a bunch of changes this patch, and I'm updating my tier list to cover them. So, in the support role, we are very much in an engage heavy support meta. A lot of the champs really benefit from the current itemization. Things like Even Shroud being very strong, Locket getting buffed, really helps a lot of these. So, the Z tier, Rakan and Rel. Rakan has been powerful for a very long time at this point. He got buffed, I want to say 10 or so patches ago, where he gained a lot of healing on his Q. Combine that with a couple of damage buffs as well, and he's definitely performing a lot better. Thus, he is in the Z tier. Rel got buffed more recently, kind of changed the way her kit functioned. She did get nerfed last patch, and I'm pretty sure the patch before, but still really performing quite well. Also works as a flex pick into the jungle. Moving on to the S tier, still a lot of engaged supports here. Things like your Threshers, your Pikes, Blitz, Nort, Leona, all of these really benefiting from the current items. Maokai, Amumu, good flex picks, also really strong with the current itemization. A lot of anti-engage also popping up because of the strong engaged picks at the moment. Things like Poppy, Taric, Talia, Janna, Braum also performing quite well into a lot of these champions. Then you have a decent amount of enchanters, things like the Soraka and Sona, and to a degree the Annie also performing quite well. For mainly just raw AP, the picks I'm definitely going to recommend Annie as well. Nico really strong at the moment. 3-way flex pick, well technically 4 if you want to flex her into the top lane. Zyra got a bunch of quality of life changes and just a straight up buff towards jungle, so there are options there. Fiddle kind of rising up in a bunch of roles at the moment. People have definitely kind of started leaning towards picking this champion a lot more. Support, mid, even top lane also starting to appear alongside the jungle. Azareth got a bunch of changes to his ultimate this patch, also performing quite well with these changes. Zyra and Azareth definitely performing well with their buffs. Moving on to the A tier, a bunch of poke champs, just not as high tier as I'd say the current meta ones are at the moment. Some anti-engage, also some lesser some engaged champs which I wouldn't consider as good as the S tier. Some of these champs are very money heavy, require a lot of gold to really come online, and I'd recommend playing for your ADC or your jungler in Clash at the moment. Mid laners also really strong role to play for, especially with some of the mid picks in the meta at the moment. Moving on to the B tier, Pantheon, still not a huge fan of this pick. He kind of is just gold hungry as a champion, and in the support role, unless you're really hard stomping, this champ does not provide you with the same amount of value as a lot of these other champs, and can just be nullified by a lot of them. Tom Kench, it's not a great champion at the moment. Gragas got nerfed more recently. Seraphine, still won't recommend this champion. It just works better as an ADC, and to a degree a mid laner, but even then kind of struggling at the moment. Lulu, still massively over-favored as a pick, because of the fact that she functions as amplifier for marks. Just not performing great at the moment. Has been hit by multiple nerfs recently. Karma, still just not performing great. Hasn't been performing great for a while. Same goes for Morgana. Both these pairings used to work quite well with Caitlyn, and Caitlyn being in a pretty bad spot at the moment just doesn't make these two particularly favourable. In the C tier, just a bunch of champions which have either been killed by nerfs. Things like your Namis, your Milios, your Yumis have just been hit by nerfs over and over again to really take them out of competitive. Set is kind of just like a pocket pick as like a flex option. Don't really value him that highly as a support. He's quite gold hungry, and if you build him as a support, he just doesn't have the same amount of value as a lot of these other support picks. Ashe and MF do function as poke marksmen, but tend to be more utility than a lot of the other ones, and the utility just isn't great. It mainly comes in the form of slows or just their ultimate, and I wouldn't recommend these picks because of it. Moving on to the ADC tier list, MF and Ashe I'm going to put in my Z tier. As this tier list is very much targeted towards mid-elo, so it'd be like your gold to your like low diamond range. These two champs are perfect at the moment for that. Really easy to play, really powerful, have really strong builds. MF being the Lethality Yomu's build, Ashe being the Triforce Kraken build, and then moving on to the S tier, Kaiser's still performing really well after her recent buffs, even with with slight nerfs to Static Shiv, has really strong builder options. Karthus, they did try to nerf in this patch, he's still really strong. Massively buffed in jungle though. Twitch, really good performing champion, has a lot of good support pairings, just overall a really good pick at the moment. Moving on to the A tier, a lot of good champions here. Ezreal, really powerful for the fact that he's quite safe and still synergizes quite well with a lot of items. Draven, really high DPS. Xayah, really powerful for the value she has in her root and just her overall DPS. Also provides her with a safety net. Kog'Maw, not as strong as he used to be. Definitely got hurt by the fact that a lot of his good pairings got nerfed, but still works with things like your Brahms. Nyla, really good champion if you have the right pairings. Seraphine, Ziggs, this is probably their best role. I wouldn't recommend playing these champions outside of ADC. Jhin, utility marksman, probably a higher tier if you do focus on having him utility, but as I see a lot of people kind of using him to take kills and try and get as fed as possible. He just isn't, like, there are just better options than Jhin. But if you're playing him for purely utility, then yeah, definitely kind of like an A tier. But if you're going for your util marksman, you're mainly going to want to pick your Ashe. If you, let's say, have a weaker ADC and you want to play for jungle or mid, then yeah, Ashe is probably your go-to. Moving on, things like Yasuo, strongest role is probably ADC. He just doesn't have great itemization later on into the game. You really do spike up things like, well, it was your Gale Force BT. I think Kraken's definitely starting to become more favored. Things like IE got buffed this patch and also can function as maybe like a second or a third option, kind of like a Akshan style build. Vayne has options in build, like makes her quite good for that. Could probably be considered an A tier pick with some of her build options, things like your Triforce, your Yomu, your Duskblade. I've seen these being built a lot and they do all function quite well on the champion. Better than Ginsu's definitely. Kalista got buffed not too long ago where they made her auto attacks to 100% damage. Still not a great pick, definitely gets out DPS by a lot of these champions and does get hurt quite badly by slows, but still not bad. Samira struggling with the Duskblade interaction nerf, but still does function. As you see, a lot of these champs B tier, which is very much considered my average tier. I wouldn't say many of the champions in the game at the moment are below average. A lot of them do function with some strong purpose, especially if you're picking around that purpose. Things like Zeri still works quite well with things like Static Shiv, even though they did nerf her really hard. Jinx, as a hyper carry, really powerful, just nerfed. The same goes for Varus, got nerfed, but still works as a hyper carry. You can also build them as a lethality option or full AP. Sivir, as a hyper carry, not really going to build her as like lethality like you used to, but kind of struggles with into certain matchups and just doesn't have the same level of range as a lot of champions. Aphelios got nerfed by pro play, Lucian got nerfed by pro play, Caitlyn got nerfed by pro play. This one was mainly like a while ago, but still all these champions kind of struggling after their nerfs. And then Senna could be considered pretty bad as a marksman, doesn't have the same soul gather rate, but there are ways around it. Things like Static Shiv can make her kind of keep up with laning against a lot of these champions. Moving on to mid lane, Aatrox gonna be in both the top and mid Z tier. He is really powerful at the moment. He is probably the strongest champion in the game this patch. So if he's open, definitely recommend picking it. Moving on to the S tier, lots of champions here. A lot of these you will see are top laners. Most top laners are just better mid laners. This is fairly common knowledge, I'd say, at this point. Still a lot of good assassins. Things like Talon, really powerful champion. Having a lot of fun with him. Things like the Duskblade, Yomu's, Gore Drinker, all these options do work. Nico, really powerful, even though she did get nerfed. Things like Anivia and Cassio are very much staples. Same goes for Swain in a way. Very much staples of the mid lane S tier. All these champs have really good either control, lane presence, scaling, stuff like this. Into the A tier, you have a bunch of assassins. I kind of put Nefari as a placeholder in the A tier. She looks really good from data-wise, but then a lot of champions look quite good from data-wise. So, the reason behind Nefari, she very much looks like a stat-stick champion, where if she's ahead, she's really powerful, does really good damage, can kind of just one-shot most people who are squishy, struggles into tanks, and if behind, similar to like a Vex, let's say, does have issues, but yeah, kind of akin to Vex. strong of her head, but kind of weak of behind. That's why she's in the A tier. She might be slightly on the powerful side, which then she could be considered S and then maybe borderline Z if it really comes out down to once you've put a lot of time into her. She is really, really powerful, but just from like early data and just around that, she looks like a stat stick. So I put her in the A tier as an assassin champion. Along with that, a lot of other champions like assassins in the A tier, which just have limitations to how hard they can carry. Maybe it's like things like they can just get shut down quite easily, or they have weaker laning phases. Things like the Katarina and the Kiana can struggle early laning phases into a lot of champions, but if you're proficient at each champions, they do perform to like an S tier level. Same with a lot of champions though. Things like the Yasuo and the Yone do, if you put a lot of time into them, perform to like an S tier level, but these champions do struggle with their itemization at the moment, especially if you're itemizing them incorrectly. Other champs within the B tier, which I've kind of just put in the B tier, are some of the scaling options at the moment. Things like Veigar and Kassadin just aren't doing great at the moment. They did get nerfed recently, but then Kassadin's nerfed a while ago, and he's just never really recovered. Along with that, things like Akali, very greedy assassin, but if you can play it well, can be considered borderline S tier, something like like along those lines. LeBlanc just not performing to the same level after the static nerfs. Gragas got nerfed. Galio, just not a huge fan of his champion. I think he has limitations within what he can do. Falls off a cliff later on into the game. Azir, I really like Azir. I think this champ's really good, but you have to be really good at playing him. A lot of the logic behind a lot of these champions is very much going for what the average player can output on the champion, because a lot of these champions are really powerful in the hands of one tricks. Assassins tend to be powerful in the hands of one tricks. If you're a one trick and an assassin, then they can be considered like an S tier pick, but in the hands of the average player, they are probably like A or B tier, because they require games and knowledge of matchups and like laning phase and roaming and stuff like this to really get the most out of your champion. Other champions I want to talk about, the C tier, Varus got nerfed quite hard. Lucian only really seeing presence because of caps, playing it in the LEC, and then Corki just not great at the moment, struggles with itemization, and just his AP poke build just isn't particularly good. But yeah, past that, top laners tend to be better mid. There are still really good mid champions though. A lot of the staples are really good, and if you play assassins, then they can be considered higher tier. Moving on to the jungle, there are a couple of things I want to talk about here. So Rek'Sai, still really powerful even after nerfs, definitely considered still an S tier pick. Ivan, really good at the moment. Daisy, still really powerful, especially if you're going your Night Harvester build on Ivan. Shralia still does work, but Night Harvester, if you really want that carry potential. Karthus, really strong after his buffs towards jungle, really benefited him. Just huge amounts of damage on this champion, can just do damage even if you're struggling in the game, and that can be really powerful in a lot of champions. Jarvan, really simplistic, might have been nerfed, or has been nerfed a couple of times, but even then he's still performing to a good level because of his simplicity. Shyvana really came back to life on this patch after 7 months of basically being dead in the water and like the worst jungler in the game. The AD build now is performing really well and probably borderline Z tier. Flexibility also has a lot of value within the game as well, because you can still go things like your full AP glass cannon, your AP bruiser, and then AD tank. There are a lot of options there. Maokai, also really simplistic, really valuable as a tank. He's probably the best jungle tank at the moment. Things like Rammus is conditional because of because you really need like heavy AD comps to really make this pick work. Poppy, good in certain comps and against certain comps. Amumu, just really simple, can be like borderline S tier because of his simplicity and how much value he brings to the table. A lot of assassins within A A tier, just because they're harder to execute than the S tier, even though a lot of them do compete with the S tier quite comfortably. Things like Eve and Fiddle, really powerful AP junglers. Kha'Zix and buffed Shaco, really good. Nocturne for his simplicity and like ease of execution within comps. Kindred and Graves, both really strong ranged champions within the jungle. Kayn has good options with both red and blue. Xin Zhao, if you build him correctly, really good. Same goes for Vi. If you build them both like lethality glass cannons, these champs are kind of nuts, especially like your Eclipse, your Essence Reaver, your Collector. All of these are really good on both these champions. Echo and Diana, good AP junglers, just not as good as Fiddle and Eve. You can kind of consider them a tier lower. Eve and Fiddle are like S tier picks, but just harder to execute. Udyr, pretty good champion, but it kind of struggles later on with his itemization. Just doesn't have great options past demonics. He struggles with his mythic. Jaxo just isn't great, and Radiant is kind of hard to work around. Lilia, also really powerful, has a lot of value into tankier comps. And then B tier, a lot of these are just high skilled champions, which I just wouldn't recommend over the ease of the A and the S tier. Things like Nidalee and Lee Sin, really good if you're good at them, but struggle if you're not so good and proficient as a lot of these, which is just easier to execute. Hecarim got hit quite heavily by his nerfs, losing 10 resists at each point on W, especially hurts during the mid game and on the 1 point of this ability. Talon, definitely more of a mid lane champion, same goes for Pantheon. Trundle, really good into a lot of top laners at the moment, because a lot of the top lane meta is AD and tanky. Beta tanks, there's a lot of them. Things like Maud, Simplicity, Nunu Simplicity, Volley Simplicity, and just like what they do is very kind of obvious. Skarner, same. Rail, very much as a flex pick. Sion, same idea. Mundo, also very similar idea of just the flexibility value. Same to a degree as the Sejuani, flexible both mid, top and jungle. Just kind of got hit by nerfs, so why she is in the B tier along with these picks. And then C tier, Wukong got nerfed because of pro play. Zyra still not performing great in the jungle. Nasus kind of struggles within jungle. No real hard CC on this one, so kind of falls off on that part. Teemo just doesn't clear the jungle absurdly quickly. Same goes for Twitch. Both of them kind of struggle against a lot of the meta picks. Gwen also struggles because she's very much limited in how fast she can clear. She has been nerfed, so she can't clear quickly. And then the Nefari just doesn't look great in the jungle, so I've left her in the C tier. Moving on to the top lane, Aatrox still the Z tier pick here. Nothing's really competing with him. His buffs were just absurd, and if you're going the correct build on him, he is super powerful. S tier, a lot of bruisers at the moment, a lot of them really benefiting off like your Gore Drinkers, your Stride Breaker buffs not too long ago on the mid patch. Quinn, really powerful with static Shiv, which is why she's in the S tier, even though she is considered like a really solo queue tied champion. Pantheon, also really good with things like Eclipse, Bork, Shojin, all these items really good on him. Nasus, really simple and has a really clear win con. Your E Shred's really powerful on a lot of the AD champions at the moment. Your W has loads of power into marksman at the moment. Kayle, really good if you're looking to scale, and then a lot of really good tanks in the top lane at the moment. Malphite, strong into AD comps. Poppy, good into as an anti-disengage option. Ornn for upgrading teammates and playing on your team. Same goes for Shen, really powerful as a team playing tank. Maokai, really cheap itemization. Same for Zac, cheap itemization. Mordekaiser, really powerful for his isolation. And Mundo, really powerful for his simplicity and high DPS. He is more of a bruiser though. Definitely kind of consider him as a bruiser. He is not the same level of tankiness as a lot of tanks. Moving on to the A tier, a lot of these champions are still really good. Things like Fiora and Aurelia, really powerful if you're good at them. Same goes for Riven, just not S tier level, because they do require a lot of games in them. But yeah, if you're proficient of these champions, definitely consider them S tier. Along with this, a couple of other bruisers, things like Renekton, really good setup, also really good after his buffs. Set, if you build him correctly, still really good. Alawi, I think Duskblade is the way you want to go. From what I've been saying, Duskblade Alawi is actually really strong at the moment, but you can still go your Frostfire and itemize like that. Trundle, really strong at the moment because he's a good answer into a lot of the AD bruisers. Warwick, more of a cheese pick, just does insane amounts of sustain and DPS early on for game. Argot, kind of simple, but you do have to be careful. He's kind of bad into like Warden's Bale and can kind of get face rolled if you fall behind against a lot of recurrent bruisers. Gangplank, really powerful for his zone control. Singed, if you proxy, or if you know how to proxy correctly and just know how to kind of min-max the champion, he's also really powerful, like S tier level. Gwen into a lot of tanks is really powerful, especially with a lot of them being in the meta. Some of the other champs on to cover in the C tier. Things like Akali, just not really that great in the top lane. She doesn't have any CC. She's really gold hungry. She just loses outright to a lot of the top laners at the moment, which is why I really wouldn't recommend her. Same goes for Yasuo. He does have tornado, like he has value in Windwall, and he has his Q knock up combined with his hold. But even then, this champ still struggles into a lot of the matchups. A lot of them do just face roll him. These very much are picks you play if you're really good at them and you know you can just kind of like ego on your enemy. Cassante, just don't play this champion. I have said this for like 2 months now. He is good if you put a lot of time into him, but he really struggles like compared to a lot of other tanks if you're not willing to put that time into him. He is like, if you're really English has failed me now. If you're really good at using his tank stance and you're really good at using his like bruisery kind of assassin-y stance, then he has value because you can use both of these stance effectively within team fights. But if you're picking him for a certain kind of playstyle, there are just better picks than that than him. A lot of tanks are just better than him for their level of tankiness and for what they want to do within fights. He's a really good pick, but a lot of the time, things like Mordekaiser have more value in that. But yeah, overall, I'm just not a huge fan of Cassante. He's a really hard champion to play, and if you don't put the games in, he really struggles. So keep that in mind. But overall, this is kind of my idea of what the meta is at the moment. Well, meta for mid-elo, I think it very much varies the higher up you go and lower you go. A lot of simplistic champions obviously dominate in low elo. Things like Master Yi will obviously perform at a higher level, but a lot of these champions are just really strong staples within the current meta, so definitely consider picking them. But overall, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.